investor friends, I'm Michelle Marki, and how would you like to beat the S&P 500 by a double-digit percentage? Well, I do, and this October 2022 could be our last chance to buy a high-yield savings bond from the US government that's known as the Series I bond, and it's currently giving a rate of return of 9.62% that's guaranteed for the first 6 months that you own the bond, and then the rate will change. But in the meantime, I predict that the next rate that will be available in November 2022 will be substantially lower than what we're currently being offered this October. So I'm planning to lock in this rate. And if that sounds good to you, even though none of this is advice, please be sure to like and subscribe to my video and YouTube channel. And I'll also share some tips about the Series I bond that could be helpful if you're considering also buying the Series I bond. And before I explain my rationale behind why I think November's rate will be substantially lower for the Series I bond compared to what it is now, let me give you some background information about this bond, which you can think of as a nickname of I bond, which kind of sounds like iPod, and that will help you not get it confused with the Series EE bond, which has such a low interest rate that I pretty much ignore that one. And so let's just focus on the Series I bond, which had its rate that it currently has of 9.62% set back in May 2022. And these rates are valid for 6 months. So that's why October is our last chance to buy some of this. And then the new rate will be valid from November 2022 until April 2023. And so you are limited to buying $10,000 of the Series I bond online every calendar year. So conceivably, you could buy some on December 31 and then buy a whole new set of $10,000 worth on January 1 every year. So keep that in mind. And also, if you had the foresight to file the form 8888, so that's 4 8s with your tax returns and your refund could afford this, you could have bought up to $5,000 of paper I bonds for a total of $15,000 worth of Series I bonds in the year. And each type of bond gives you that amount of limit. So you can buy $10,000 of Series EE bonds in addition to this $15,000 worth of Series I bond. And even though the Series I bond's annual purchase limit is $10,000 or $15,000 if you include the $5,000 in paper I bonds, that's only per person. So if you're married, you and your spouse could potentially have $20,000 or up to $30,000 if you include the paper I bonds between the both of you. And also there are some ways that you could buy even more I bonds, but that would be having to buy some across different means. So if you have a business, many business types are able to buy Series I bonds. So if you have an LLC or are a sole proprietorship or have a corporation, you could buy $10,000 of Series I bonds in the business's name. And also if you have a living trust, you can buy another $10,000 worth. And also if you have children, you can buy $10,000 in each of their names if you gift it to them. So those are also some additional ways to buy Series I bonds. And also keep in mind the following limitations or restrictions that you also have, where you're required to own a Series I bond for at least a year. And the Series I bond is in a term of 30 years. So if you still continue to own a Series I bond after 30 years, you won't continue to earn interest on it, but you may want to redeem it by that point in time, because then you could be losing money against inflation if you continue to own a bond that's not earning any more interest on it. And also these bonds are zero coupon, which means that you don't get paid throughout the life of the bond, but you get the interest when you redeem or cash out the bond. So you get all the interest at the end of the bond's life, pretty much, whenever you decide to cash that in. And also keep in mind, if you cash in the bond before 5 years, then you will forfeit the last 3 months worth of interest. So that's another factor that could affect your final amount of interest you get. And so ideally you want to own the bond for at least 5 years and up to 30 years ideally. And then also the bonds will be taxed at your ordinary income tax rate. So this is different from stocks, which were usually taxed at the capital gains rate. So let's say you have an ordinary income tax rate of 22%. That is somewhat higher than a capital gains rate that most people have of 15%. So also keep that in mind if that is a factor in your decision making. And where you would buy the Series I bond is at the treasurydirect.gov website, which is an official US government website that recently had a facelift. But underneath this facelift, when you actually log in, is still a website that's reminiscent of the early 2000s. So don't be shocked if you discover underneath that initial layer when you log in that it actually looks kind of old school. That's basically how it is. And also, if you're interested in learning even more details and how a Series I bond compares to a high yield savings account, feel free to check out that video for more information about the Series I bond. And remember how I said you could beat the S&P 500 with a Series I bond right now? Well, if we take a look at the S&P 500 with the ticker symbol SPX, that's down about 21% at the time I'm recording this video. And if you adjust that for inflation, it's down more like 28.77%, which if you compare to the annualized rate of the Series I bond of 9.62%, that's actually up against CPI inflation of 8.3% by a total of 1.32%, which is currently beating the S&P 500 by about 30%. And you're not entirely beating the S&P 500 by 30% because that 9.62% is only guaranteed for 6 months. And like I'm going to talk about in this video, I think is going to be lower in the 6 months after that. It's still pretty good. So nonetheless, you're still beating the S&P 500 in the double-digit percentage range. And also, like Warren Buffett likes to get high yields regardless of what the source is. In this case, I'm also willing to be agnostic about the source of high yield returns. It doesn't have to only be stocks. If this bond is pretty much risk-free, as long as the US government doesn't go bankrupt, I'll take it any day of the week. And now brace yourselves for the fun part of today's video in using math to explain why I think the November rate for the Series I bond will be lower than it is currently. And to explain this, I need to tell you where the Series I bond gets its rate. And in simple terms, it's a combination or a composite of a fixed rate plus an inflation rate. And some of this is actually multiplied out that I'll explain in a second. But the first component of the fixed rate is set by the US Treasury, and the fixed rate is currently 0%, which is guaranteed for the life of the Series I bond. So you're guaranteed to get a rate that will never go below 0%, even if we have deflation. So that's a nice little perk there, even though it's not that reassuring that the most that you might end up getting is 0% someday on a Series I bond. But the nice part about the Series I bond is if we have higher than average inflation, and right now inflation had been pretty high over the last couple of years, so that's why the Series I bond became attractive. And to explain where the inflation rate comes from, this is based on a semi-annual inflation rate that comes from the Consumer Price Index inflation for all urban consumers, or also known as CPIU. And it's based on a 6-month period before May 1st and also November 1st every year. And so for the rate that was set in May, that was based on the 6-month percent of inflation change between October 2021 through March 2022. And so for this November, it will be based on the CPIU percent inflation change between April 2022 through September 2022. And so the formula for the Series I bond rate is a combination of adding the fixed rate plus the semi-annual inflation rate times 2, plus the fixed rate times the semi-annual inflation rate. And in this case, because the fixed rate is at 0%, we can ignore that when we're multiplying that by the semi-annual inflation rate. And since it's 0, you don't have to add it. So we ignore the first and last parts of this formula to only focus on the semi-annual inflation rate times 2 to get the final Series I bond rate of 9.62%. So that came from multiplying the semi-annual rate of 4.81% times 2. And so if we take the same formula and think about what it might be for November, it involves guessing at what the September CPIU inflation rate might be. And that's going to come out on October 13 from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So I don't know it at the time I'm recording this, but I'm going to take a wild guess that it's going to be pretty close to what the CPIU was in August. And so that was at 296, and what it was in April 2022 was at 289. And so if it stays pretty close, that's only a difference of 7. And we take that difference between August and April and we divide that over what it was in April of 289. So you do 7 over 289 and I get a rate that's about 2.45%, which if I multiply that by 2 gives me an annualized rate of 4.9%. And now if September is a little bit more inflationary than August was, that might come out to maybe 298, which might give us an annualized yield of about 6% instead of the 4.9%. But either way, even if it falls somewhere close to that range, it's still way below what it was of 9.6%. So I'm bracing myself for the expectation that I'm not going to get to enjoy a future rate that is as good as what it is now. And so based on what I just told you, even if I lock in the 9.62% for the next 6 months, and then if the rate goes down to between 4.9 or 6% for the following 6 months, at best, my full year rate of return might only end up being about 7.25% to 7.8%, which is still almost close to what inflation is because, like I said, CPI inflation as of August had been at 8.3%, but I'm still losing a little bit against inflation. And the people who actually did the best against inflation were the ones who bought the Series I bonds between November 2021 through April 2022 at the 7.12% rate, plus the 9.62% that they got in the 6 months thereafter, for a final rate of about 8.37%, in which they would have been in lockstep with the exact amount of inflation, basically. So they ended up doing the best, but it's not so bad even if we lock it in now. And so all of this still beats what the stock market has been doing this year. So I take some solace in that. And you can think of this as putting your money away for an emergency fund where if you don't need $10,000 for the next year, then you can rest assured getting about this 7% plus overall rate of return for the next year. And then if you end up redeeming the Series I bond at the end of a year, then you might be giving up maybe about 1.5% because that's the total amount I get of 3 months worth times 0.5%, if that's reflecting each month that I'd be giving up for 3 months from the more optimistic rate of 6% in the last 6 months. So I think that that's not such a bad amount to have to give up, even if you redeem it in a year from now. And so even though normally high inflation is bad and it's making my cash burn up in flames, this is the one time I wish that inflation stayed kind of high, just so I could be more assured that I'd have a high rate of return for at least a year. But maybe we can't all get so lucky, but sometimes we get lucky in other ways, like with how gasoline is back to levels that it was about a year ago, where I gassed up at about $3.05 a gallon. So I think that sometimes we save in other ways, and maybe if we don't always win it all, that's what life is. It's about the ups and downs, and we take what we can get. And so if you enjoyed this video or learned something, please like and subscribe. And I wish you well on getting the highest rates of return you can, wherever it comes from, whether it's from stocks or bonds. Till next time.